Hi, Rachel Mead here, President and founder of Enhanced Prep. Thanks for joining me today while we take a look at an Enhanced Prep differentiator. One of the ways that I firmly believe Enhanced Prep is different from the other test prep companies out there is we make it our mission to help students say yes to the right test. And I want to spend some time with you while we talk a little bit more about that. So, when it comes to the SAT, and again, I'm not going to insult you by taking the time to read through this slide. You can pause the video if you need to do so, screenshot it, whatever you're looking at. But when it comes to content in terms of what's on the SAT and content of what's on the ACT, the tests are very, very similar. Now, how they ask questions and what they choose to emphasize and how they put students through different types of endurance, especially mental, are dramatically different. And that's what I want to spend some time talking about today. So, one of the things we need to remember is when it comes to the SAT is now adaptive. So, what does that mean? It means that students have to perform to a certain level of accuracy, very high accuracy within their first module on their verbal in order to place into their second module and have it be a hard level. So, medium difficulty of questions that come in that first module. If they miss too many of those, they're going to move into an easier second module. They have to be highly accurate with that first module in order to move into a harder second module. Now, we also have to remember that the test writers are basically conditioning the students in this first module that makes them feel like they have a bit more time per question. But then when they move into that second module, while their time per question hasn't changed, the questions are more challenging, they're a little bit denser, there's more analysis that has to be done or more math that has to be done, and therefore it feels more rushed. Now, when we're looking at the spread of the types of questions between the modules, they're pretty darn similar. There are some types that we will see in Module 1 versus Module 2, but again, we're looking at some reading-based questions, some writing-based questions within that. When we look at the SAT math, we can see that it really heavily weighs the algebra portions. Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 are tested more heavily than their data, statistics, problem solving with their geometry and trig as well, right? Those aren't quite as important. But we also have to remember for many students, these concepts are a little bit further removed. But math is also adaptive on its own. So how a student does in verbal does not impact how they do in math. So they do verbal module 1 medium, then they move into a verbal module 2, either easy or hard. Then they have math module 1 medium, and then again, depending upon what that accuracy looks like, they'll either move into a math module 1 hard or a math module 1 easy. So what does all of that mean? Well, we need to know that that math makes up 50% of their total composite score, so 200 to 800 points. The reading and the writing come together for their verbal score of 200 to 800 points. So the composite on the test is the sum total of combining both that verbal and that math. Now, I need students and parents both out there to really understand what's happening in terms of the scoring. If a student does not get into the harder second module, they will not be able to break a math score of 520 or a verbal score of 520 because there's a ceiling in place. Even if they get every single question right in that easier module in that math or that verbal, there's still a ceiling in place that they will not be able to surpass without having a higher degree of accuracy in the medium questions in order to get them into the hard. And that means their overall composite score is not going to break into the 50th percentile. It's never going to be above that until they're getting that accuracy up. Now, if they do move into that harder second module, then there's a floor in place. It says even if they miss every single question in the math hard, they're going to hit a minimum score of 460. Even if they miss every single question in that verbal hard, they're going to hit a minimum score of 520. So module 1 technically has a bigger impact on the student's score than what module 2 does. And students really need to understand that when they're approaching their studying for the SAT. Now, there's been a lot going on within the world of ACT as well. They launched a shorter version of the exam digitally last spring in 2025. Shorter version of the pencil and paper launched in September. And now this spring, for those students that are testing during the school day, we're now going to see that shorter version happen in school as well. So there's now technically 4 different forms of the ACT that a student can register for. We've got the ACT Core, which is the most common, and that's going to test them on English, math, and reading only. From there, they can choose to add the optional science. They can also add the optional essay, or they can add both the optional science and the essay. So students need to have a good understanding of what schools they're interested are looking for. Do they need to see the science? Maybe the school doesn't, but does my major? Do they want to see the essay? Again, that might depend upon major. Now, we tell all of our students that it is the best practice to take at least one version of the exam with the science and the essay included because you're showing that you're raising your hand in terms of academic curiosity, and you never know which schools, programs, or scholarships are going to want to see scores in all. So get those while you have the opportunity to do so, but you definitely don't need to do them all every single time. Get selective in terms of when and where you're going to prepare for those pieces. Now, while the ACT isn't adaptive, it has changed in terms of what it's doing with beta testing. And what we mean by that is they're not scoring certain questions within each section because they're practicing future questions on future test takers. And they're like, oh, look, this student scored a 31 in their English. Let's see how they did with these 10 questions. Did we make them too easy? Did we make them too hard? What are we going to change before we insert them again? However, these questions are in no way, shape, or form labeled or designated for the student. So they have to put their effort into every single thing that they're seeing within the section and not worry about what's being beta tested until that score comes out. But we also have to recognize now if we only have 40 questions that are scored and the English has a maximum score of 36, we need to understand how weighted every single one of those questions is now in order to get to that score of 36. Within the math, we only have 4 questions that are being beta tested. So that is the section that has the least impact in terms of what that looks like. In the reading, while there's 4 passages with 9 questions per passage, there's one whole passage that isn't going to account towards their score. So what does that mean? We have 27 questions that are accounting for those 36 points. The reading bell curve is steep as a result of this. That optional science, we've got 40 questions in 40 minutes, and we just have one passage of 6 questions that are being beta tested. Now, it's important. A lot of students tend to get nervous when they know science is on the ACT, but science on the ACT is not biology, chemistry, or physics. Science on the ACT is reading charts and graphs and analyzing data. And there's typically only 3 on average of those 40 questions total that are going to require any type of outside knowledge. One of the favorite things for the ACT to test on science knowledge is recognizing pH in terms of an acid or a base. And we've got some great memory tricks for you to help with things like that. So when it comes to how the ACT is scored, the ACT is an average of the English, math, and reading together in order to hit that composite. Now, that science score is still out of 36, but it is entirely separate. So even if a student hits a perfect score in the science, it's not going to have any impact on that composite. So while there could be some schools, some programs, some majors, or some scholarships that want to see that science score, remember that the composite needs to come first. So we got to lock and load in that English, math, and reading composite score and then focus in on that science. Unless a student comes in with a really high science score to begin with, let's get it out of the way early while we're fine tuning everything else. So now let's talk about some of those major differences, right? Because this is where it becomes so important to help students say yes to the right test. When it comes to the SAT, it is only in a digital format and it requires heavy analysis of the question. Very few of the questions on the SAT, if any, are straightforward in terms of what they're asking. So students have to decipher what's my job and then complete the work in order to do it. It is also going to reward students that have a stronger math skill set. Now, the ACT, students can take that either pencil and paper version or digital version. Now, some students might score better on one or the other, but also having the opportunity to practice or experience both sides helps a student know which test they should be taking. We have seen composite score swings as big as 5 points, depending upon which version of the ACT a student is taking. So that's another major criteria of how to say yes to the right test. Now, while they have to work at a faster pace, the questions are more straightforward. There's a lot less analysis and deciphering that they have to do. It's going to work towards students that have that stronger verbal skill set. And again, they can choose to add in that science and essay when and where appropriate. So, what else is going on? Well, again, remember that that SAT is adaptive. So, how a student does in their first module is going to have a bigger impact on their score, and it's going to determine which questions they see next. The ACT, even when students take it in a digital format, is not adaptive. They're going to see one set of questions regardless of how they do. Because of that adaptive format, there's going to be two math sections and two verbal sections, where on the ACT, each subject only appears once. Now, this can really come into play in terms of a student's focus, endurance. Do they need to work through all of one type multiple times, or do they need to switch gears in order to keep their interest? Part of what's important for saying yes to the right test. This is also huge, huge, huge. I'm going to put a great big star on this in terms of the endurance, because this test isn't just what you know. This test isn't just how fast you can demonstrate you know it, but this is also a test of endurance. And we need to remember that our brain is a muscle. I talk to my kids all the time about how they're using their brain juice, their brain battery, because as they use it, that battery is going to drain and it's going to need to be recharged. So when it comes to the math, the SAT has the math at the end, which is when the brain is most fatigued, when the body is most tired, and when that level of focus is going to be most important, right? Part of why it emphasizes or works better for students that have that stronger math skill set. When we're looking at the ACT, they hit reading last when their brain juice and battery are drained. So again, if reading is a challenge for them from the beginning, it's going to be that much harder when they're working on the ACT. If math is more of a challenge from the beginning, it's going to be that much harder when they're working on the SAT. We also have the way the test is scored. So again, as a reminder, that SAT is a sum. I also want to point out, again, the difference in the spread or the emphasis of where that score comes from. SAT, 50% math, 50% verbal. When we're looking at the ACT, again, it's an average. We see lots of students get exceptionally high math and English scores. Their math might not be quite as high, but they can still hit a high composite because of that average. When it's a sum, it's a little bit harder to compensate for that. But I also want to point out, look at this. We have a very different spread between that verbal emphasis versus that math emphasis. So what does this mean in terms of helping students say yes to the right test? So when we're looking at those scores, we also need to remember what happens in terms of super scoring. Now, super scoring says you get to mix and match. On the SAT, we're taking a high math score from an exam and a high verbal score from an exam and putting them together. But because the reading and the writing are in the same section, students have to increase them both equally or keep both on focus equally in order to be able to maximize that score. So to super score, we're going to take the high math from one exam, the high verbal from the other exam, and their super score comes in higher than either individual sitting. Now, again, the SAT super scores for students when they send those score reports over. So again, as long as they're taking the official exam more than once, they get to take advantage of this. It's not something they have to designate before they test. When we're looking at the ACT, English and reading are their own sections. So that really means when we're looking at this coming through here, again, assuming that the student is choosing to take that recommended science, as well as that recommended essay, they can mix and match these scores from any exams that they're taking. So for students that need a little bit of a more targeted focus, being able to say, I'm only going to focus on the English or I'm only going to focus in on the reading in order to get that super score composite can have a very different benefit much better for them when we're working ACT rather than SAT. All right. Will one test be easier than the other? We get this question all the time. For some students, a very small amount of the population, they're not. They're equally suited for either exam. However, the vast majority of students are going to show a stronger aptitude, whether that's for the emphasis of math versus verbal, or it's the emphasis on how the tests are asking questions or the pacing that they're having to move through them. We do not recommend that students prepare for both because when we get that student that comes in and says, but it matters so much, I want to take both. They're going to put a little bit of study time into the SAT and a little bit of study time into the ACT, and we're going to see minimal improvement on both of those. But if we can help that student say yes to the right test and double down on their emphasis of their study time, we're going to help them get a much more consistently higher score than splitting their effort and their focus between both. So before you start your process, make sure you're saying yes to the right test in terms of which one gets your time, focus, attention, and energy. Now, what about where the student wants to go to school? Within the United States, every single four-year college and university, in-state, out-of-state, public, private, military, you name it, every single US college and university gladly accepts the SAT. Every single college and university gladly accepts the ACT. There is not a single school that says we prefer this, we give bonus points for this, or we want you to do both, which means the student is in the driver's seat with this in terms of their ability to say yes to the test that fits them better. And remember, the vast majority are going to come back and accept that super score as well. ACT sends a single score report for that super score the same way SAT does. So again, no difference when it comes to those. So what can you do to determine for sure which test you're better suited for? Well, I want to start by saying nothing is better than taking a full-length practice SAT and a full-length practice ACT. We can analyze SAT or even PSAT score reports in order to help you out as well. When we see a verbal score at least 50 or more points higher than that math, that's a very good indication the student is better suited for the ACT. Why? Yeah, ACT's 2/3 verbal. When we see that math score come in higher, regardless of how much higher it is, that's a good indication that the student's better suited for the SAT. Why? Yeah, the SAT's 50% math, where the ACT's only 1/3 math. If the student is coming in with a composite score of 1250 or higher, that's probably saying that their brain likes the way the SAT asks questions, and that could be another piece that we fit into the mix. But again, remember this is only an indicator. This is not the be all end all. Full length practice tests of both is the way to go. Now that's asking for the students to do a lot, right? Because they can't even take them on the same day, much less the same weekend because of that brain juice battery. You also have external things that can come into play. Were they feeling a little bit under the weather? Were there activities going on later in the day that they were anxious to get to? Did they just get done with a really crazy week of stuff going on at school? So what we've done to solve that is we've developed our enhanced prep diagnostic test. Now, this is a completely free practice test for students. They can take it in the digital format so that we get a chance to see how they're doing with that, especially since the SAT is only digital, and it's just over 2.5 hours. This has sections of both SAT and ACT questions in it so that we can analyze, here's how the student did with their SAT, here's how the student did with their ACT. It also takes a look at how the endurance of which sections come where on which exams impact that brain juice battery that we keep talking about. So I've got a QR code right here that you can go ahead and scan. Students, you can get signed up for our Diag and take that. We highly recommend taking it on a non-school day and in the morning before any mental fatigue can set in, and you do want to complete it in one sitting. Now here, I want to show you what the report from our Diag shows us. In this particular case, we can see the breakdown of how the student did with their various ACT sections, and we can see that they hit a 78% correct of their ACT questions. We can also see the breakdown on how they did with SAT, and we can see how they did with their SAT total. Now remember that that math is counting twice, right? So half reading, and writing together for that verbal half math. So it does have a bigger emphasis on that math accuracy as that's coming into play. So under the same conditions, mental conditions, physical conditions, emotional conditions, where they're sitting and what's going on in the exact same scenario, we can help a student determine which test they're better suited for. Sign up for our Enhanced Prep Diag today and make sure that you are saying yes to the right test. Thanks for joining me. We'll talk soon.